6,
5, 4,
3,
3.
2, 1, go.
Alex, I have a complaint. How's that to
Is it
start?
about the countdown?
No. My complaint, I'm testing audio
Is it
here.
the couch?
Well, first I'm going to test, I'm producing this show as well at the same time. So I'm just going to test a couple things, make sure we're good to go, and then I'll complain.
Okay.
So here's my complaint.
Uh-huh.
So we invited people to ask questions, and now they've started to do that.
Yeah.
And this week I wanted to be selfish. I had so many things I wanted to talk about with you, and I was so excited. And then I looked at all our questions. I was like,
wow, we got a question.
but I want to talk to Alex all by myself.
Oh, wouldn't that be fun? If only we worked in the same office and could talk together all the time.
If only.
Oh, man.
I'm just joking. It's awesome. We're actually getting some questions rolling in, which is kind of fun.
Yeah. Who would have thought it?
Should we acknowledge that they're listening to us now?
Yes.
All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Red Couch Theology podcast.
Welcome to the podcast of the uncomfortable Red Couch.
Oh, yes.
And we are jumping into a new series at South. And
We are.
in this podcast too.
And evidently it's exciting to some folks.
Yeah,
There's a lot of
baffling to me because I wasn't excited. Well, no, I was. I like little behind the scenes. I'd kind of said to staff maybe, what was it, 3 months ago or so. It was just, I think it was before Christmas. I said, I'm thinking about Lamentations or Jeremiah for Lent.
Yeah.
And if you're unfamiliar with Lent, or actually maybe even have come to think Lent is a bad thing, and that might be like because you exited Catholicism or because you grew up in a Protestant world that was anti-Catholicism. Mm-hmm. Like that was what I got, well, we don't fast for Lent. I remember trying to give up chocolate biscuits one year, and my mom was like, no. I don't even think I ate that many chocolate biscuits, to be honest, but it just felt like, wanted to do my part, get involved. And so if you've come with that mindset, I can understand that. I've been there. And yet it's this practice that's way older than a Catholic. It's older than an East and West church split, which if you're familiar with church history, is sort of like 1092-ish. There's a split between East and West.
I just want to know how you, like, I'm in church history. I've been in multiple church history classes. And last week we covered the Great Schism. I couldn't pull the date. I knew it was in the 10s.
And I could be wrong. Who knows? Say anything confidently and people will believe you.
Welcome to the Red Couch Theology podcast, where we make stuff up and say it with confidence.
Confidence statements.
Oh, goodness.
But regardless, the 11th century split, just in case I'm wrong. So it's earlier than any of that. The earliest Lenten practices seem to come from even the 4th century, perhaps.
Yeah.
And they were focused on a couple of things. They were focused on preparing for Easter and pulling some of the elements of Jesus' 40-day fast in the wilderness into everyday life.
Yeah. You said it in a way that I just loved on Sunday. It was something along the lines of what you get from Easter, what you put into Lent.
Yeah.
Is that how you said it? That exact way? I
think I said I, but you could say we. We as a church, we as individual followers of Jesus, we get out of Easter what we put into Lent. Now, of course, on a macro level, I'm massively overstating it. The atonement work of Easter will continue whether we do Lent or not. The big story of Easter.
You only get saved if you do Lent.
Yeah. Let's get back to some of that works theology. I like it. But your understanding of it, my understanding of it, it seems every year that I do Lent as a serious practice. By the time I get to Easter, Resurrection Sunday, I'm like, I am ready for resurrection and to let it imbibe me in a new way.
Yeah.
And if I'm honest, there's other years, even when I'm preaching Easter, that it can kind of skip me by as just another season to get through.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of happy-go-lucky guy. So on Easter Sunday, I'll still have a big smile on my face and be giddy as a school kid because I just love singing the Easter Sunday songs, the resurrection songs on Resurrection Sunday.
Yeah.
But I think the life change seems tied into the practices.
Well, and you know, this is some illustration, maybe we even used on this podcast for some other issues, but it's kind of like I was in this studio art class in high school, and early on in that class, it was like a college level drawing illustration class. And early on, I kept getting docked on my work, on my art pieces, because I didn't incorporate enough contrast. And so the teacher kept saying, Aaron, you're good at this. You're doing some great pieces. It's a great representation of what you're trying to draw, but it's not visually as appealing because you don't have dark enough darks and light enough lights. Yeah. And that's part of what's going on with Lent.
Yes.
Is you have this deep darkness in the Lent season, which then accentuates and highlights the bright of
Which
Easter.
I will say, in your defense, and to knock a question off the list already, someone asked where was our artwork taken for our series
in the style of trompe-l'oeil, I think.
Yes.
Maybe
I don't know. But it was, we took Rembrandt van Rijn's Jeremiah lamenting over Jerusalem painting, which I feel has no contrast. And I feel like that about a lot of Rembrandt. I feel like
so maybe it's not trompe-l'oeil, but
I feel like he doesn't do a lot of contrast just regardless. And I'm like, everyone loves Rembrandt. He's like a legend. And yet, so I feel like you should have been able to get away with it.
Well, sometimes those paintings, they require a ton of like spotlighting to fully appreciate because they are so dark and dingy. And it's hard to translate into screen or something.
But if you were wondering where our artwork came from,
that was one of our questions.
It was one of our questions.
Rembrandt.
And Rembrandt is the guy that we chose for this one.
I said Teresa, our communications director, does all most of our art design, graphic design. I said I should tell everyone that you painted it for the series. She's like, no, you better not tell people that, because I definitely did not.
And then we should have them paint it live on stage as we're doing it. And the beautiful thing about using Rembrandt, of course, is that it's so old, you don't have to pay royalties or anything like that to use it. It's like free to use. So that you are right. Generally, contrast on a TV show, on in a movie, in
a piece of music,
art, piece of music. It's what makes things stand out. In a worship set, you move. There's a flow. If everything's just at the same level, it just doesn't.
We
work
do
in the same way.
We do old and new songs. We do quiet and loud songs.
Yeah.
We do up tempo and down tempo songs, and that's all strategic to sort of create this journey.
So Lent provides the contrast to Easter, and then the challenging question is, if we don't do stuff like Lent in the Western church, where's the space to tap into some of the elements, the places we don't? Where's the space to go to places we don't want to go? That like we don't do that. And every time I think about like that idea of spaces we don't want to go, I always think of Jack Nicholson in A Few Good Men, where he's like he's kind of yelling at Tom Cruise, the young optimistic lawyer, and he's like, deep down in places you don't talk about at parties, or something like that. That's my best Jack Nicholson.
Wow, all right.
He like, we all have those places we don't talk about at parties. And the Western church can at times just be a constant party. And the only time we do death and sadness is a funeral or memorial service. And the next Sunday, we're right back to everything's awesome.
So in addition, we kicked off the series for Lent, but specifically the other thing that's a little bit interesting about people's intrigue related to the series is you chose the book of Jeremiah.
Yeah, and I've regretted it ever since. No.
To go through Lent. And we've already heard several people out there say, I'm really excited for the book of Jeremiah, which you're weird. But no, I'm just joking. I'm just joking. I'm actually really excited. after you preach the message, by the way, if you didn't hear the message, I'm going to give a shout out extra this week because I loved the way you wove this message together, the way you talked about Lent, the way you made me excited for Jeremiah. What?
Yeah, I feel like it's some of the southiness of South. We are a strange community of faith, a brave community of faith that is willing in Lent to go through Jeremiah.
Yeah.
And it was that or Lamentations, which is equally as problematic. So there is I wonder whether some of the excitement about Jeremiah is that, one, it's rarely a series book. Like when you say to people, how often have you been in a series on Jeremiah? Most hands go down. Even like, how many of you read Jeremiah for your daily devotional reading? Like it's not super common. And some of that is simply, it's a get through book. It's like the back end of Exodus. It's like parts of Leviticus. It's like the book that you do because you feel like you should at times.
Yeah.
And it's super, out of all the books I've read in the Bible, which is all of them.
Good. I'm really glad.
It's super complex.
Yeah.
Like it's so complex because so if you're someone who's into what people would call source criticism, you might have a view that Jeremiah was just penned start to finish by the same person. That's fine. Could be accurate. It doesn't feel that way when you read it. It feels...
Define source criticism for people a little, just briefly.
Yeah. So
it's a whole world.
The idea that a book could be made up of multiple different sources.
Authors.
Authors. So, and maybe the same author, but written at different times. So Jeremiah has narrative sections that don't always feel like they fit in some of the poetic sections. So when you read, if you were to read it without having a name on it, without having any information, your feel would be, this isn't the same person speaking. This is a mixture of different people. Now, it could be that it is the same person. What I would encourage you to just ask, though, is my faith in the book and God speaking through it dependent on it being the same person? Because I don't think there should be anything about whether it's written by the same person that makes you dependent on it. Like, that's an assumption.
Yeah, and source criticism's like this whole world in and of itself. If you want to look that up and research it, if you want to nerd out on the documentary theory and stuff like that, you can go look those terms up for yourself. But it also kind of comes in vogue and out of vogue in different seasons, depending on scholarship and manuscript discovery.
And then Jeremiah's just written over a long period of time.
Yeah.
So you got maybe 30 years, 3 different kings. It's like you trying to write. Now we feel Jeremiah's a long book. It's the longest book in the Bible by word, which is the only way you can really measure a book. And so we try and imagine writing a book that covers the lives of George H.W. Bush, Bill Clinton, George Bush Jr., and Barack Obama, and keeping it to the length that it is in Jeremiah, the length of Jeremiah. That's a lot of history to cover, a lot of change to cover, a lot of different seasons.
Yeah, and if there was no wars or no tumultuous situations, then you'd maybe be able to try and summarize pretty heavily. But no, there's exile happening.
Yeah.
There's thriving in exile and return, and it's just you can't gloss over some of these historical events.
So the reason I picked those presidents, not some older presidents, is because I think there's this event that you just mentioned. There's this moment of the conquering destruction of Jerusalem, followed by so Jerusalem is conquered in 597 BC. The temple is destroyed in 587 BC. So there's 10 years of war, 10 years of defeat with some kind of existence as some vassal state, some state dependent on another state, paying tribute, all the best people have gone. And then finally, a group still there rebel. So Jeremiah covers that period. So there's good. Everything seems great, which is kind of what we covered on Sunday. There's worse, there's worst, and then there's hope. And so interestingly, as we get to some of the questions, maybe we'll unpack this more. the period of American presidents I picked is fascinating because Bill Clinton, some people look back now and say like the 90s was the most peaceful decade that the world has known.
Yeah.
In the last in maybe 1,000 years.
Yeah.
Like there's actually relative peace in most places. There'd been the first Iraq war, but everything seems to have settled down. And in actual fact, globally, like the communist rule in Russia falls, the Berlin Wall comes down in 89. There's like some level of like world peace, just like Josiah. And as we talked about with Josiah, this first King Jeremiah is around like.
Are you calling Bill Clinton Josiah?
I'm saying that there was a level of everything is great, and there were people at the same time that were like, no, it's not great.
Yes.
For ... for this reason, for that reason. Now we could go into all the political things that you might. I mean, like, that's just like a minefield. But the economy was great under Clinton. Like the late 90s economy, everything's booming, everything's up. The sense of American dominance, the Cold War ends. There is no competitor anymore. Like the biggest competitor is Japan. And that's just on an economic, technological level. But in reality, like American worldwide supremacy is unmatched.
Yep.
And then there's 9/11. Like then there's this moment where suddenly there's an unimaginable event that takes place.
At least on our shores. Yeah.
Yeah. So you think about like two huge towers in the middle of New York that symbolize what? Greatest nation in the world.
Yeah.
Richest nation in the world. And then suddenly there's this moment of tragedy. And everything changes. Like in 2000, you are going to meet people at the gates at an airport. You're wandering through like this half-hearted security, or like everything's chilled. And then suddenly you're going through long lines with metal detectors and all these other elements and stuff like that. Suddenly the place people fly from is a closed off entity. It's separate from everything else.
Yeah.
All based on that one thing. And suddenly there's wars now everywhere. There's Afghanistan, there's Iraq, there's all of these things going on. And the threat in return. As an American, are you safe in other countries anymore? Like how are you perceived? How is the nation perceived? So you see that switch, and you think about, for those of you that are old enough, which is a chunk of us, think about how different now the 90s felt compared to suddenly 2002, 2003, 2004.
Yeah. And we're still in this tumultuous situation all the time. Ukraine war and Russia, and is China getting involved, and on and on and on and on. And there's a little bit of undercurrent of intensity. Yeah.
Now, where Jeremiah will get fascinating for us, as Jeremiah predicts things are going to get worse, and they do, the question becomes like, why do they get worse? And this is where it gets like deeply problematic for us as Westerners.
Yes. All right. Well, before we go there, do you mind if I pause for a second? Because we're going to get some questions related to that. So I think we'll be able to get back to that, because I'm excited to hear what you're about to say. Don't let me forget.
Okay.
I don't think our listeners will let us forget. We'll have to go back to this next week if we forget. But before that, could we just set up a basic structure of what's the role of prophecy? Because Jeremiah is a prophetic book. Mm-hmm. It's in the prophetic section of the Old Testament. And so maybe just get us a little bit of a framework for what is prophecy scripturally, and then let's go into some of those tricky questions.
So that's fun, because I think there's two words that are really helpful with that, because prophecy is a tough one for us 21st century Westerners, because we tend to think tarot cards, fortune telling, like kind of, person with some kind of head scarf thing with a ball and a mystical accent. There's two words that I think are helpful in understanding prophecy. Prophecy is a combination of foretelling and forthtelling.
Yeah.
So there is the predictive aspect, but it's primarily dependent on, if you keep doing this, this will happen. So it's not so much the day by day, like in 10 years, this will happen on this day, and the day after this will happen. And there's times it works like that. Daniel chapters 1 through 8 fascinatingly work very much like that, which has made people question, were they written before the event or after the event? Because generally that's not how biblical prophecy works anywhere else, like the day by day. So that's a whole other dating debate that's fascinating. But generally it's a lot of there's a lot of societal questioning and challenge. It's like, this isn't how you're supposed to live. This isn't God's way for us to be.
So there's this wonderful professor at Denver Seminary, and in the Old Testament department. Oh man, I'm going to draw a blank on his name. That's so horrible. Anyway,
but he's great.
He's so great. And I'm sure I'll talk about him again sometime soon. But he liked to say it this way. He's a German guy, and he's like, biblical prophecy is more about telling off the nation.
Yeah.
It's telling on people and saying, you should do it differently. It's not supposed to be like this. Yeah. And if you actually look through all these prophetic texts, the lion's share of all of it, which is what you're saying, is that.
That's the.
And there's a tiny little fraction.
Word.
There's a tiny little fraction of it that's the foretelling of the future.
And the writer Walter Brueggemann has this incredible book called The Prophetic Imagination.
Yeah.
Where he talks about, there's the prophecy aspect, which some churches do really well. This isn't how society should be. And then there's the imagination world, which some churches do well, which is like, this is what it could be. And there's very few churches that are able to do both at the same time. And so Jeremiah is that prophetic voice. He is an insider who becomes an outsider in order to tell off the nation.
Yeah.
And that, even in the first chapter that we looked at this week, he starts to allude to some of that. In actual fact, there seems like an appropriate terror in Jeremiah's voice as he starts to imagine what his life will look like.
Yeah.
I mean, some of that, like, I'm too young, is that like element of, don't put me through this. Like, why would you do this to a kid? I mean, Jeremiah's probably 18, 19 years old.
Yeah, totally.
And so God says to him that, don't look at them to be afraid of them.
Yeah.
If you choose to be afraid, I'll make you terrified is almost the language.
Yeah, this do not say I'm too young. You must go to everyone I send you and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you, and I will rescue, declares the Lord.
So the undercurrent of it seems to me, no, life is going to get bad, Jeremiah, but I'm gonna make sure it's okay in the end.
Yeah. Someone once told me when I was just first starting Bible college that it was wise if you were considering ministry to go through to count the cost, and to maybe use Jeremiah to do that. Yeah. Because basically he gets a calling and says, you're going to fail miserably. Mm-hmm. You're supposed to tell them to stop doing stuff. And then I guarantee they won't listen.
Yeah.
And it's all going to fall apart. It's all going to come undone at the seams. And so this professor was like, you need to go through and say, hey, if I do ministry, what if no one ever listens?
Totally. And I have,
how would you feel?
Yeah. And I have a mentor and friend up in Ohio, and he and I have similar personalities. And one of the things he challenged me on, like a while back, is he said, Alex, like at some point you can't be nice. Like, and he said, you're like me, like you like people to like you, you like to be nice. And so one of my questions that I asked him was, give me some practical things you did to help overcome that. And he said, like, counting the cost is a big one of those. So you go into a conversation, you know what you need the outcome to be.
Yep.
You know what the easy pathway is. And so you count the cost of the hard pathway before you have the conversation. You're like, this is where it's going to go. This is what could happen. And I'm going to be okay with it.
It could blow up in my face.
Yeah.
And that's kind of the gift that God gives Jeremiah right off in the beginning. He says, this is going to be a hot mess.
Yeah.
Buckle up.
Yeah.
I still want you to do it.
Yeah.
That's, it's actually kind of a kindness because he doesn't have to deal with that anymore. Like, what if I succeed? What if my identity falls apart because I'm a bad prophet preacher? That's Jeremiah doesn't have to
What
ask
if nobody comes to my church?
Yeah, exactly. He doesn't have to deal with that because God's like, yeah, no one's going to come to church.
But there are parallels to, I mean, Jeremiah tells people things they don't want to hear. And there's a whole other bunch of people that he references that are telling people exactly what they want to hear. So in chapter 8, he says there's a whole bunch of other prophets and priests that are saying peace, peace. Yet there is no peace. Like, don't worry, don't worry. And so Jeremiah goes into this setting and forth-tells everything that is wrong with society, even at a time under Josiah where things are pretty good. And yeah, that leads us to that question around why is all of this happening, I think, if you're ready for that question.
Yes. All right. So we actually got quite a few questions. Some of them are actually similar. And so I'm not sure if we're going to be able to check off and just go question by question on all of these because that might take too long. But maybe let's start with this question. Because I think it'll partially answer someone else's question as well at the same time. Is it fair to think that all wars that have occurred on earth are God's way of bringing judgment? Even perhaps the modern world wars 1 and 2, today's war between Russia and the West? Or was God's judgment only exacted on this way prior to Jesus, in this way prior to Jesus?
That's such a great
Go.
question. It's such a great question. So the challenge of Jeremiah, of other prophetic texts, of aspects like conquest, like the destruction of Israel and Jerusalem, is that it's very clear to the biblical writers that this isn't just the result of bad foreign policy. It's not just that they elected poor leaders, other than that those leaders didn't lead them well spiritually. Like, the only premise for this invasion that is given is you have not lived up to the covenant or lived into the covenant that God made with you. You've chosen to live the opposite way, and judgment comes on the back of that. Like that, though, there is no other premise. Now, at the same time, I think when you read the Old Testament, you can say some wars come under that, but some don't. So in the story with David and Bathsheba, this story where David has his big moral failing, where he takes someone's wife and has the husband killed. The phrase is given at the time when kings go out to war. It seems like in the culture, there was just a time where everyone was like, you know what, we're feeling a bit rowdy. And that's hard for us to understand.
I've never heard it described that way, but
that's what it seems to be, right?
It's like, oh, it's springtime.
Yeah.
We should go to war.
Just feeling some angst. And so there is that. There are times where battles, wars are just spoken of in those terms. No, it all got a little angsty. You got to keep your guys busy. So there are wars that are spoken of as specifically judgment, but it isn't everyone.
Yeah.
We tend to hear more about the ones that are spoken of in those terms.
Yeah.
So that I think even in the Old Testament framework rules out the idea that there's just God is behind every war on some level. Now then there comes the challenge of of how we read scripture, which we've talked about multiple times on this podcast.
And I hope we continue to talk about it.
And I hope we continue to talk about it. So the challenge is this, like when Jesus appears on the scene, and Brian Zahnd, one of a pastor over in, I think he's in Missouri, says this in a brilliantly concise way. Jesus appears on the scene, and the message that Jesus brings is this, is God looks like Jesus. He has always looked like Jesus. He has never not looked like Jesus.
Yeah.
And so then when we read the Old Testament reflective of who Jesus is, that's when we have to ask the really challenging question, is all of the Old Testament God's thoughts about man? is some of the Old Testament man's thoughts about God. And were they wrong? Were they just seasonal? Were they permanent? All those different elements that come in. So if you think about something as central to the Old Testament as an eye for an eye, like a bedrock concept of how you judge between people and how you control retribution, that's distinctly presented in the Old Testament as given by God to the people of Israel. And then you have Jesus who comes and says, I tell you, not an eye for an eye, but choose to not enact vengeance. You're left with two really difficult choices. One is to say that that was God for a time, and two, they were wrong about it in the first place. And neither of them are actually very comfortable when you think about it.
No, yeah. There's no third option?
I don't think there is.
Huh.
If you can think of one, what's the third option?
Or the third option could be that it was the best God had to offer humanity, given where humanity was at the time.
So that would come under the other option, right? It was for a time, but your extension is it's not reflective of God's real personality and heartbeat.
Yes.
So so either way, like when it comes to something like war, the challenge point is if we take that premise, God looks like Jesus. He's never not looked like Jesus. The premise seems to be God has always been anti-war.
Yeah, and someone I can maybe hear someone who's sharp out there saying, well, that's a quote from a modern pastor. Like, you first prove that God looks like Jesus.
Yeah.
Because that's actually where this problem comes from as a follower of Jesus, as a Christian. Because having a religion with a God that punishes people or creates war, that's not a very uncommon kind of deity. In fact,
no,
the majority
that's
of
all the deities.
The majority of all historical deities have this sort of their best interest in mind. We're just peons, like Babylonian gods and these other like Greek mythology, you name it. That's actually a framework for understanding deities that's more common. What the problem that we have with it as followers of Jesus is we have this figure who comes, who the scriptures say in John 1 and Hebrews 1 is the exact image of God, and then he dies for his enemies. He doesn't kill his enemies. Yeah. He dies for his enemies. Then you're like, well, shoot.
And I think that's like, I used the succinctness of that Brian Zahn quote. And really, it's just a paraphrase of Colossians.
Yes.
Like he's the image of the invisible God.
Yep.
So
totally. I agree. I just wanted to make sure you anchored that.
It's the, and it's of course not a physical thing. It's not to say God looks like a Middle Eastern man. It's to say that character-wise, personality of teaching, that's what God looks like. That's his best for human beings. So we can look at the Old Testament and say there were aspects to it that weren't his best. I'm quite comfortable with that.
Yeah.
And yet there seems to be a new story with Jesus that's unveiled.
Yeah.
And a new look into God's heartbeat. So the question then becomes like, what does it mean for God's war? What does it mean for wars in the modern sense?
Yeah. So like for a lot of Christians, just to preamble what you're saying, for a lot of Christians, they're like, that's fine. New covenant, new rules. And they're real comfortable with that.
That has its challenges as well.
Because there's still war.
And we tend to like that. So what the fascinating thing that I think Jesus does, his presentation of who he is and therefore who God is, doesn't allow a worldview that just says God is on the side of this nation or that nation. And that's really hard for us to understand. So there's this joke in a comic show in England about why does the First World War start? What started World War One? And there's all these different chain of events you can follow. But one of the soldiers from a rich family who's like super pro-British says, well, the war started because of the empire building of the German people, or the German Kaiser. And one of the other soldiers, who's a bit more thought through, says, George, currently the British Empire spans about a third of the globe, whereas the German Empire is limited to a small sausage factory in Tanganyika. Like, if anyone, we may not be completely exonerated on the empire building front ourselves.
Yeah.
Like, there's this awareness of, wait, no, this isn't really one side that's right and one side that's not.
Yeah, and even the other prophetic books, to some extent, even Jeremiah, this also really plays out in the book of Isaiah. You have, God says, I'm going to raise up another nation to punish you. Oh, and they're evil too.
Yeah, so
in fact,
they'll be punished.
They're
in
even
their
worse
turn.
than you are. And then I'm going to bring them around too. And so you're like, whoa, well, which nation's in the right? Which one's in the wrong?
He'll even refer to Nebuchadnezzar as my servant. He refers to Cyrus by the same title. And yet both of them in their turn are punished for what they've done.
Yep.
So there is a complexity there that theologians have been wrestling with for a few 100 years at least, if not nearly 2,000 years, that we're certainly not going to solve in a 45-minute to an hour podcast.
Did we just spend 15 minutes to tell them we can't answer the question?
I don't think we said that, hopefully. But I think that we did acknowledge the complexity of, yes, it seems like God has specifically said this war is happening for reasons directly related to obedience. And so we see that as a premise for some wars, even though it has to be seen through the lens of war is not God's ideal for humanity. God's ideal. So where I think that I would love to push the question is, what does it mean for us as a nation now?
Yes. So, which brings me to another question. So hopefully we could spend 3 episodes to unpack that first question. But I think where you're taking it starts to span into, I might have to take a second to find it here. Another question we received, how does the climate of the age today and the life in America and other Western countries look and parallel the lives that Jeremiah was seeing and talking about in Israel? Are we living a life that seems alive? Oh, sorry. I can't even see my own computer.
Seems alive even though it leads to death.
Yeah. Actually leading to death that you describe in your sermon. So that gets into, like, basically, is the reason you're preaching this series through Jeremiah because you're trying to say, America, you're just like that back then, and God's bringing the judgment. The hammer's coming down, and there's more questions we can go into about that in a moment.
Yeah, and so where I think that becomes fascinating is, so you see this real switch around the time of Jeremiah. This language of remnant starts to come into the Old Testament a lot.
Yeah.
There's the nation that is judged, Israel, Judah. There's people dragged off to exile. Some of them eventually come back, and the word that's used regularly is, no, there's this remnant. There's this people, this small group that is still reflective of the nation that is left. It's almost like this movement that stops necessarily talking about Israel quite the same way as God's chosen people, but talks about a people within that people that are chosen in a distinct way. And then you see that, that it seems to me, and other people would speak more to this period in between, like what's known as the intertestamental period. So you've got the last book of the Old Testament, Malachi, written somewhere around 400 BC, and then nothing really until the New Testament period, and there's different rebellions there. There's the Potomac Empire, the Seleucid Empire, there's the Maccabean Revolt, all of these things that are just historically just no time to cover. There's things happening even though we don't hear about them in the Christian Bible. And then you've got the Jesus movement out of a group of people that are essentially living in their own land, but not their own people.
Yeah. Rome is ruling.
Yeah.
And then,
And it's a different kind of model because for centuries, everyone practiced the same model. You would go and capture people, you'd move them to a different land.
Yeah.
And it's not till actually this group of people we're reading about in Jeremiah come back 70 years later that suddenly this King Cyrus says, you know what? People are probably more loyal in their own land. I'm just going to send them all back. It's a bizarre switch in foreign policy. No one has ever done that. And that's what Rome does too. Like they leave people in the land. They take soldiers off to war, but they say, keep paying taxes to Caesar, you'll keep living.
Yep.
And so that shift there into what Jesus does creates this tension between, well, who are God's people now, the church or a nation? And Paul even wrestles with Paul wrestles with this for a good chunk of Romans, the book, like Romans 9 through 11 are all like this. Wait, who's the branch now? Who's grafted in now? Like, what does this mean? What about the people that never...
What about Israel?
Yeah.
And it interestingly, like the early church was considered the people within the people.
Yeah.
And so you had this nation that's not a nation, Israel. And then there's this subgroup of people who said, we uphold the kingdom of God.
Yes.
We're followers of Jesus. But at the time, until around 70 AD, there's like, they're just, the Roman Empire just considered them, that's just all the Jewish people.
Totally, yeah. They're part of the way. There's a few weirdo Gentiles that have joined them and stuff.
Yeah, but they're still pretty much Israel's. Yeah.
Complete wiping out of Israel, or Palestine as it's called at the time, in 70 AD. The second temple is destroyed, and so then Israel disappears off the map until 1948. There is no Israel nation for centuries.
Yeah.
And so the question that like hovers all through that period, it seems, is, does God still pick nations? And so to a whole bunch of people, he does. Like Constantine claimed Rome as a Christian nation, and said, this is now how you worship. This is who we are. Britain had a certain Zionist theology of, we are God's chosen nation. We are the light to the world.
Yep.
We're going to go and we're going to conquer, and we're going to use it to bring the Christendom to the world.
Yeah, and even the founding of America was like, we want religious freedom. And so all these Christians, even though it wasn't just Christians, by the way, all these Christians, I'm doing air quotes if you're on the podcast, come here to find religious freedom and to set up a truly Christian nation, which if you look at the history is spotty at best, whether that's actually the case. But, and then America's now the Christian nation. We're the new Israel.
Yeah.
So what I hear you saying to answer this question, are we today in America and other Western nations, so it includes the other nations, are we like this in that same sense? Is this, so what you're actually questioning is, can we even talk at the national level when it comes to this kind of judgment?
So I think there's been this language for a long time of the nation has turned its back on God.
Yeah.
And I think what we actually mean by that sometimes is there's a couple of options. Sometimes we mean less people go to church. Sometimes we mean moral standards have changed.
And sometimes we mean we don't have someone who calls themselves Christian in office.
Yes. So all of those get very muddied when you start to talk about at what level can you say God is blessing or not blessing a nation? Is America the most powerful nation in the world because of God's blessing? Does God mind if Russia becomes the most powerful nation in the world, or China becomes the most powerful nation in the world? Does he mind if China isn't a majority Christian? Does he stop minding if China suddenly has more Christians?
Well, when you say
America?
it like that, the question is not whether God minds, I mind.
Yes. Yeah.
Because it affects me. I'm living in America, so I want this one to be the one that God's hand
totally.
is
And
on.
I mean, I have lived in a country that used to be the most powerful nation in the world.
Yeah.
I mean, literally until 1912, Britain has the biggest navy in the world. It has the largest gold resources in the world. It's like, it is the center of everything still. And then there's this gradual switch after you guys bailed us out of a couple of wars that starts to swing the pendulum.
Yeah.
And so as a British person asking the question, my question might be like, well, why? Like, why?
God's judgment.
Potentially, right? That's the question that we're wrestling with, and it doesn't have a simple answer. Like some of the answer to that is simply there is no logical, on the surface reason to why, in a divine perspective, America should rise and Britain should drop in the power rankings of nations.
Well, yeah, the logical progression is just be more obedient to God and you rise.
And so then the question becomes, is there anything that we can look at and say, is there anything that was more Christian about America than Britain? Because we're now not comparing America to China, to Russia, to, I'm air quoting now as well, enemy states. We're comparing it to allies.
Yeah.
We're comparing two nations that are very similar in their philosophies. Britain has a state church.
Like, there's no...
You guys don't have a state church.
Yeah, you can teach the Bible in church, in school.
I grew up singing Christian songs every single day in school.
Yeah. So in one sense, you should be more powerful.
So that's the challenge, right? Like, why does one nation come to the forefront and one not? And it seems like what we can say is this. That might be because God wants to use them for something, but it might not be because their behavior is great. So it's exactly what we see
with Babylon.
This is the most powerful
horrifying
nation in the world. This is the superpower. So I think for the question, like my intriguing like counter question almost is, what do you see in the nation right now that tells you all is not well? Militarily, most dominant nation in the world. Standard of living, at least in terms of like income,
best in the world.
Best in the world. Like there's the small, like tiny little nations that have like ludicrous GDPs and stuff like that. But in general, like there's lots of metrics that you might pick and say like affluence wise. Even when I moved from England, the towns I've happened to live in, I was instantly like, oh my goodness, the standard of living here is so much higher.
Yeah.
The disposable wealth is so much higher. And so what are we seeing that says that that's changed? And could it be that we've lost our way as a nation and nothing's changed? And then could it be that simply God's metric in the kingdom of God era is, I want more followers and worshipers?
So I think the question is actually, and some of the other questions flesh this out a little bit more, is actually related to, no, maybe we feel like everything is awesome, like your sermon, but the writings on the wall were about to fall. So I think the question is couched in this assumption that morally we're off as a nation, and therefore as a nation we're going to be punished by some other nation, and that's why we're seeing increased power for China and these other things. And that essentially the prophetic voice, modern voice, would say the writings on the wall were gonna fall. Is that what you see going on?
I would say that could
prophesy against America. I dare you.
So I would say that anytime you start seeing nations that make terrible moral choices en masse, you almost inevitably see consequences from them. And whether God orchestrates those or whether He's set in place an organic aspect to which those things take place anyway, I could go either way. But here's what's fascinating with the remnant idea. I'm not sure it changes what we're called to do as followers of Jesus.
Amen. Yes. As followers of Jesus, yeah.
Yes. So simply, we are called to continue to live out the way of Jesus, to voice that way when it feels countercultural, and to accept the consequences when that countercultural voice is considered as the voice of the enemy.
Yeah,
which it inevitably becomes, I think.
Yeah, this is actually the gift of being a follower of Jesus. We're citizens of the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
That's a nation that Jesus inaugurated, and the message He preached in the gospel, come be a part of this kingdom. And that's our primary citizenship. Our secondary citizenship would be to a nation
And that secondary word is so important, right?
Secondary.
Because it's so easy to flip them. I've shown multiple times that like hilarious Babylon Bee meme where they've got like, it says something like, Christian man says heaven's second best choice if he can't just keep living in America in the 21st century. Like, life is awesome, everything's great. And we'll get to that in Jerusalem in chapter 5 when we push into the week after this.
Yeah.
So I think that I'm fascinated by the question. I don't know that we can say for certain America's behavior will certainly lead to an obvious judgment. It took centuries for Babylon to be judged in the way that God said they would be, and they eventually disappear off the map. There's a whole rhythm of the same thing with Egypt at different parts that are, we're talking hundreds of years of dominance at different points with no obvious repercussions.
Yeah.
And so for us to start saying, oh man, it must be in the next election cycle. Well, God's timing very rarely seems to work like that. And just as this horrific life of Babylon, these horrific practices that they have are being talked about as resulting in judgment, they are still maintaining their dominance in every category available. They are the nation everyone is looking to.
Yeah.
And in Jeremiah's lifetime, that won't seem to change for a long time.
Yeah. This next question, I think was really well written. And I think we got to move fairly quickly if we're going to hit some more of these questions because we've been going for a while. But do you guys feel that we as Americans might be going off the rails and traveling on the slow road to hell, in quotation, without seeing the mileposts and signs that you describe in the sermon on Sunday? Are we living like the people of Jeremiah was trying to reach in his 30 years of ministry? Are we on this slow road? And we've already been talking about this a little bit, but
and I think I think where we could talk about that maybe differently is. I don't think I could say any more about the broad nation aspect.
Yeah.
I am intrigued by the followers of Jesus aspect.
Exactly. Yeah. I totally agree.
How we find so you could bring that into individual practices, like how are our views on different things shaped? Like how does morality look in the church compared to what it looked like at different points in history? And most churches will go one of two directions when we talk about that. And I touched on this a little bit, some of the complexity of this on Sunday.
Yeah.
Because for the Eastern Church, sin is primarily a corporate thing.
Yes.
And for the Western Church, it's primarily an individual thing. So in the Western Church, we would say God is deeply interested in what happens in your bedroom. Like that's just been how we've phrased things for a long time.
Yeah.
Like that's some of the primary way that we determine righteousness or not righteousness. Have you been divorced? Because divorce is a bad thing. Have you practiced like monogamous heterosexual marriage? Because that's the only option. Like so, and I'm not saying that's not right, but I'm saying those are the ways. Have you cheated on your taxes? Those are our moral standards.
Do you go to church? Do you tithe?
Do you attend a church service? Or do you smoke cigarettes?
Yeah. Do you drink? Yeah.
Whereas in the Eastern Church, they've primarily thought of sin as, are you contributing negatively or positively to the health of the world
environment
around you,
of the world?
Yeah, environment's probably too
not
the broad word environment. Totally. Yeah.
Yes.
Not the ecology, but the just everything around you.
Yes.
So again, now in the modern world, a whole bunch of people are saying, well, the church started going wrong when it stopped being the people that were coming alongside people on the point of death, people who were living on the streets, people who were in the worst and lowest place. As soon as Christians stopped doing those things, that's when things started going bad. And a whole other wing of the church would start saying, well, it was when Christians stopped being really anti-divorce that things started going bad. It's when they're not anti-abortion enough. That's when things started going wrong.
Yes.
And broadly, it seems
so which one's right? Tell us.
Both, right?
Yeah.
That's the hard thing, right? There is no better or worse in that.
Yes.
It is both.
And I mean, I guess it's just to push this issue of the national thing a little bit further, I think it's super helpful to continually remind yourself, because I feel this myself. If you have this wrestling to try and separate your Americanness from your kingdom of Godness, and because if you can separate those two out, then things start shifting in the way you interact with these kinds of issues.
Yeah.
You start asking, what's best for the nation?
Yeah.
Or maybe the better, more Jesus way thing to ask would be, what's best for the kingdom? Because let's just say, hypothetically, and this might ruffle some feathers, but I'll say it so that Alex stay safe here. Hypothetically, let's say there's this unprecedented revival in China, and it becomes the most beautiful Christian, moral nation on the planet Earth. Would we not want it to take us over?
Huge question, right?
If you're a kingdom follower.
Well, and I would say, look at that from my perspective. If America was generally more righteous than Britain, should I not celebrate its rise? Surely it's only a good thing.
It's a gut check as an American and as a follower of Jesus. Like, there's this, like, you almost like, oh goodness, like, hypothetically paint that picture out. Like, does the kingdom win? The kingdom of God win? Or does America win?
Challenging question.
It's super uncomfortable.
Like, as far as I'm aware, and I'd love someone to pull some statistics on this. Like, there's the government aspect. More people have come to follow Jesus in China in the last 100 years than followed Jesus in America currently today. Like, when they the Iron Curtain started to come peel back, I think they estimated between 80 and 100 million underground Christians in China living in the face of persecution, living the way of Jesus, even when it was considered toxic and considered anti-communist, anti-China. So,
and there's some horrible things government-wise from China and all, and Russia and all these things. But the point is, gut check. Which kingdom do we want to win? The kingdom of America or the kingdom of God?
And that's a really challenging thing to push into. And so I think our longing, it's totally normal and important for you to long for your nation that you were born in to follow in the way of Jesus.
And it's also the most access we have to shift the goodness in the world. We can vote a certain way to try and advance the kingdom.
Where that kingdom participation can lead you, which I think is wonderful, is William Carey, the missionary I wrote my thesis on, lived 30 years in England before he moved to India, died at 72 in India. And after 30 years in India, he said, I'm Indian. You know, I this is the nation I've spent the most time in now. That's how I consider myself.
And if you've ever eaten Indian food, I don't blame you.
But he never lost the centrality of, before any nation, I'm a kingdom of heaven. And that, like, language is all through the New Testament.
Yeah.
If they had wanted a place to call home, they would have found one. But they consider themselves, sojourners, foreigners in this world. And that's been a huge challenge to me in terms of my willingness to leave a nation that I called home. That still has a pull on my heart in lots of times, which I don't think is a bad thing. Again, I totally understand the love for America that I see in so many people.
Totally. And I think it's beautiful. Yeah, I mean, I'm a brother in the military, grandfather in the military. I'm not at all poo-pooing any of that. But
the kingdom of God has to come first. Yep. Now, where I think that other question also goes is, I think someone mentioned the Asbury revival, or the Asbury experience that's kind of still continuing at the moment, as I understand it. And I think my only observation of that is, if that's God's work, that's super exciting. And I always look at those things like in Acts chapter 5, someone asks Gamaliel, this really well-known speaker, like, what do you think about what these people are doing? These Christians, what should we do? And he's like, let's just accept, like, right now we don't know. Be careful you don't find yourself fighting against God. If it's God, you can't stop it. One of the things I would always say seemed to me to be markers of revival. And I got to live in something that some people called a revival in England. And yet I would say never hit all of these notes, loads of people come to follow Jesus, and there was a huge change to behavior
Yes.
in the people that experience it. So it's not just we sang songs for 5 days in a row. When the Welsh revival and the Hebridean revival took place, the pubs were just empty. Huge drinking cultures, guys getting blasted every single night, and suddenly they weren't. Suddenly they couldn't sell beer because everyone was in church. There was a change to the pattern of living.
Yeah, or even revivals in the New Testament where the economic system of a whole city starts falling apart because they won't buy idols.
Yeah. So they always seem in the end to push there.
Yeah.
Not just we feel like we should be in church every night.
Yeah.
And so there's been revivals similar to that have been, it's a 6-day-a-week worship service.
Yep.
And they've not come to anything in terms of how the world looks different.
Yeah.
And it seems like ultimately we get to sit and say, yeah, I'm so excited. But if that's the work of the Spirit of God, like my prayer would be and should be, God, we want that here. Bring it.
Yeah.
Like, that's exciting.
Bring it here and may it be transformative to us. We have already gone a full hour. And so we should wrap it up at least with maybe some closing thoughts. So what, all right, as followers of Jesus, as people who attend South Fellowship Church, how do we deal with this question related to this prophetic voice that we've heard in Jeremiah? What could we do this week to lean into some of this?
So I think that there's a corporate word for us as a church, which might be keep doing what you're doing. Keep choosing to be for those on the margins.
Yeah.
Keep choosing to press into that. There might be a challenge for us in choose to press into holiness. Choose to press into living a particular way, to choosing a particular path that may not always be easy. Because certainly, as some of those questions touch on, there is this tension between where culture goes around us and where the church goes.
Yeah.
So the temptation for the church will be to either completely step outside of culture or to completely mimic culture.
Yeah.
And somewhere the narrow way feels to be to stay engaged enough with the good to be able to live differently where it's bad. And that's so hard to do.
It is.
And so figuring out, a really good word on this I just got from this mentor I was chatting to yesterday, where we asked, in line with some of those questions that we talked about at the start of Jeremiah, some of those, the willingness to count the cost. He was telling me about a couple he was really close to. It was a distant family member, second cousin, and that second cousin was gay. And the moment New York made gay marriage legal, they came straight round and said, "Will you marry us?" And he was like, "Oh, no." And they were like, "What do you mean? You love us? Like, you're always having us over for dinner. Like, we're in your house all the time. You really care for our adopted kid. Like, you're the most involved family member that we have. Like, why would you not marry us?" And he's like, "Well, personally, my belief is that marriage in a Christian sense is between one man and a woman. And so my principle says I can't." And we've come to understand kindness as approval. Like that's like like love as approval. Like if I am connected to you, I have to be willing to approve of everything you do. And that's true on a big cultural level and on an individual level.
It sounds like a whole nother hour episode.
It really could be. But I think that premise is that we keep loving people, which is the basic premise Jesus gave us, that in terms of how we live in his way with his heart. We continue to love people, and yet we don't ever get to a point where we say that has to be 100% approval all the time.
Yeah, and so I guess the challenge is for us as a church family, which is what we have most close access to, is to let's increasingly become a community that is a remnant, whether America's in power or another nation's in power or whatever. We want to be the remnant that stays faithful to the way of God and the heart of God and whatever's shifting around us.
And that the
world.
complication of that is a constant vertical and horizontal conversation. A horizontal conversation with those around you, while having a vertical conversation with God. Well, the next time someone drives into the back of your car, you have to decide what is the Jesus thing to do in this situation. Is it to get your car fixed? Maybe. Is it to pretend you have whiplash so you can get like some kind of lawsuit going? Yeah, probably not. Like there's some no's and then there's some yeses there, and so I think that that constant vertical conversation, which we talked about in Listening to God, the series before this, is so important. Go and live horizontally with people around you, but constantly keep that vertical conversation going.
Love it. All right. Well, that was a dense episode. And we're just starting Jeremiah. We love y'all. Thanks for tuning in. We hope that was helpful. I'm sorry we didn't get to all of the questions that were given. I have a feeling they'll circle back around throughout the series. And so maybe we'll get to some more of them later. But thanks for tuning in. Like, subscribe, comment, rate.
Absolutely.
The things.
And if you wanted a whole nother stuff, someone from my small group just sent me a message saying, how old is the earth according to the Bible?
Right now? Let's start it right away. Oh, man.
Okay. Love you guys. Thanks for checking us out.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye.